Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Wrap. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, today joined by Hermann Pretorius. Right, so today we're going to be covering mostly by-elections and South African political dynamics. Hermann and I have a lot to say on this. I just want to mention first, though, because it's the big international story, and I don't think we're that well placed to comment extensively on it, but I'm sure many people have seen on social media, we pay a lot of attention to politics, the murder of the American right-wing commentator Charlie Kirk, who was murdered while speaking at an event in Utah, in the US. And we don't really know that much, but this does seem like it might have been very much an act of political violence. And I'm a South African guy, but I have a very fond place in my heart for the United States. It's a country that I deeply respect and love. And to see it sort of treading this path of political violence is one that makes me feel very sad. So hopefully the people who did this are brought to book, and the US turns away from this path of seeing increasing violence, because it's very ugly stuff. Don't know if you have anything to add, Herman.
Yes, I do actually. And what over the last half a day or so since this happened late yesterday South African time, what I think has been the saddest issue reverberating around the world is that, of course, a young man is dead who only spoke. He wasn't, whether one disagreed or agreed with him isn't relevant. This is a guy who, in a real way, spoke. He wasn't, as far as I could tell, violent, and his ideas were presented in a spirit of debate. And words aren't violence. And I think it is tragic that we live in a situation where it has been normalized to consider words violence, and therefore justified to respond to someone using words you disagree with violence, and with fatal violence in this instance. However, the sadness goes to the fact that I haven't seen this level of instinctive hatred almost on an anonymized basis in a long time. And one of our colleagues reminded us that after Hendrik Verwoerd was stabbed in Parliament by what turned out to be a mentally ill man, Dimitri Tsafendas, with a letter opener, I think, a National Party minister yelled at Helen Suzman, I think, in Parliament, saying, "It's your fault. It's the fault of you liberals. You've done this. You've killed Prime Minister Verwoerd." And the sad thing is that we've seen that same thing happen now again. And credit to people who I dislike, like Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, and even Governor, Newsom, who, before it was even clear that Kirk was dead, spoke, I think, quite conciliating, or in conciliating tones, condemning the violence. Now, that I'm not saying that we shouldn't investigate or criticize where they may have been involved in sort of violent speech, metaphor use, or whatever the case may be. But it is sad to look at America and to see the world's most important historical republic tearing itself apart over something that I think should probably be a source of shared sadness. And I'm reminded of Mitch McConnell, who wrote in his memoir of how depressed he was when Kennedy was assassinated, and he wasn't a Democrat. He was a staunch Republican, but even he spent days in depression over the fact that there was this heinous act, and I sort of miss that. And it's sad that I think too much of America, especially perhaps on the American right, where I, until recently, would have classified myself most probably as more naturally aligned to. I'm worried that there's been a replacement of virtue being seen as weakness and vengeance being seen as strength. And I hope that the shock of this can have an arresting effect. But we'll wait for the facts and we'll see what comes out of it. And of course, we'll pray for a widow and two young kids.
Very dramatic to see such scenes, and unfortunately, the footage of it went very viral, which was not pleasant to see. All right, but let's return home, and there have been some rather dramatic by-elections in South Africa in the past day. We had three important ones that happened yesterday. We had Ward 130 in Naledi in Johannesburg. We had Ward 1 in Kokama in the Eastern Cape, and we had Ward 7 in Nala on the border, sort of northern Free State, that kind of area around Bothaville. So let's go through these sort of one by one. Let's start with Ward 130 in Naledi. This was formerly, there's a ward in Soweto. It was one of those places where once upon a time the ANC would feel very comfortable, not really facing too much of a challenge. You know, the ANC would get 70-something% of the vote in a ward like that, and then get like the EFF getting maybe 9%, and then the DA getting like 6%, and that was about it in terms of challenge. How things have changed. In 2021, in this ward, the ANC got about 56% of the vote. Action SA got about 19% of the vote, and the EFF got about 16% of the vote. In the 2024 provincial elections, the ANC's support dropped from 56 down to 43, but it wasn't, up for election, so it wasn't necessarily indicative of what the final result would be. Now we've had a by-election after the last ward councillor was murdered in his home by gunmen, a crime for which no arrests have yet been made. And the ANC did even worse than it did in 2024 in this ward. The ANC got 34% of the vote. Action SA got 23% of the vote. MK got 22% of the vote, clearly taking from the ANC here, and the EFF got 17% of the vote. The PAC, ATM, and a new party called VUCA SA all stood in the ward as well, but they didn't do so well. PAC got 3, ATM 1, VUCA SA less than 1. So, Hermann, this seems like really bad news for the ANC going into the local government elections in Joburg. Soweto is one of those places where the ANC has been strongest, and it's arguably one of the places where they've delivered the most in terms of upgrades and development and infrastructure. And here they're barely holding a ward with a third of the vote, which once upon a time, not that long ago, they would hold with maybe 2/3 of the vote. What do you think we can get from this?
So, for anyone interested in by-elections, there's really two people that you need to follow, and that's Wayne Sussman, who writes for the Daily Maverick about by-elections, and of course Darby Skoltz on X. You can follow both of them on X. Their commentary usually very good at disseminating, what the numbers mean. And then changes in the numbers. I don't always necessarily think much of the political analysis that comes from sources like that. But in terms of assessing credibly, objectively, what the by-elections show, these two are, I think, the go-to people. And Darby makes this point that the ANC is 9 percentage points below last year's election. So roughly a 10% drop, or 10 percentage point drop from the 40% result they got last year, meaning that they're on 30%. And to that extent, the IRR's polling from April, May this year was, I think, the first public opinion poll to show the ANC at 30%, indicating just how far the party had fallen. And what has become even more interesting is that I spent some time yesterday looking at some of the Social Research Foundation polling data to just get a sense of what a post-ANC South African landscape looks like, because I'm increasingly, asked that question: where do the ANC's votes go? And what becomes incredibly sort of almost disconcerting about that analysis is to draw a table and draw a graph with the ANC on 30%, then on 25, on 20, on 15, and to understand that these are now feasible options. In 1993, the Canadian Progressive Conservative Party dropped from 43% to 16% in a single electoral cycle. So there's precedent for when the wheels come off. It just sort of, it's a floodgate that opens. It's not a gentle trickle. So the EFF, I think, would be quite happy with this result. MK, of course, quite happy with having such a barnstorming performance in a Gauteng ward where they are lining up to specifically, I think, strongly contest in Joburg in the upcoming local government elections. But I must say, if I were either the ANC or the DA, for that matter, in some of the other by-elections we can perhaps look at now, I would be very, very concerned. And you can see the bluster from the ANC coming, this is an endorsement of the people we want. Yeah, but that's not what matters. It's really your trajectory, what you're on. And it is clear that this is now a 30% party, possibly dipping even further below, because municipal elections, the next big general election test, are generally unkind to the ANC, with a sort of a deficit from their national performance in the by about 5 to 7 percentage points. So all of this is just coalescing to really say that the ANC is on it genuinely, feasibly, realistically on its way out within the next electoral cycle or two. Not perhaps completely, but as a party, as a dominant party, it's done. As a party that can command, it's done. And we spoke about this before the show. We don't see the mechanisms within the party for recovering.
Yes. So, two other things here. I mean, firstly, I think there's something to be said about, let's say the ANC has an absolutely atrocious next local government election. They're still going to be the largest party in parliament for, another 2 or 3 years. What does that actually look like? Because they're still almost certainly going to hold the presidency. But what is a party that's, draining away support like that with so many votes in parliament? How does it behave? What does it do? It still has a lot of legislative power. Do you think there's any chance that there could be some push in parliament for a fresh election earlier than 2029? So that's one thing. The second thing is, interestingly, the DA decided not to contest this by-election, as far as I can tell. And Action SA would certainly be very happy with this result. I think there've been a lot of reasons to think that Action SA is not doing so hot right now. So this is an amazing result for them, coming, second in this award, beating out MK. Do you think, what does this say about the DA's efforts to take Joburg? Obviously, when you have a by-election like this, there's a lot of local things. We don't really know necessarily what the perceptions of the individual parties' candidates were on the ground, so that can always kind of make these things look a bit different. Maybe the Action SA candidate was a really great guy who is well known in the community, and that helped them. Maybe the MK candidate was a really great guy. We don't really know. But so on those two questions, I mean, those are two quite big questions. But let's deal with the first one first. So what does an ANC that is falling apart but still holds lots of seats in parliament look like? And could we have an early election, do you think?
So constitutionally, we can only have an election, I think, by 2027, unless there's a presidential vacancy. So how it works is Parliament can vote to dissolve itself by a supermajority, and then we go to the country and a new Parliament is elected. But that can only happen after 3 years from the previous election. So that'll be 2027. However, there could be an earlier election if there's a vacancy in the presidency, i.e. Ramaphosa resigns or whatever the case may be, and Parliament fails to fill that that vacancy within, I can't remember where it's 30, 60 or 90 days. I think it might be 30 days. Then the acting president or sort of the chief justice of the country must call for a dissolution of parliament, and there will be fresh elections. Now, if you are an ANC seeing your national support share plummet, you're not going to want to go to the country prematurely. So I don't see anyone in the ANC understanding or sort of coming to the desperate conclusion that they need to vote for their own detonation. So I don't think there's a feasible chance for early elections. I think the ANC will ride it out. But what I do find fascinating about the ANC is the extent to which they seem not to be able to recover from the last year's elections, and that they've really descended even further into factionalism, that you don't see an ANC at national level trying to consolidate its support, to unify, to recalibrate. In fact, the ANC is probably now less united than it's ever been in its history. And on top of that, you've got the separate branches of the ANC going their own directions. You've got the ANC in KZN really sort of taking the GNU model to heart, governing with the DA and with the IFP there. Then you've got the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, or the ANC of Panyaza Lesufi, really taking the opposite route of being as opposed to anything smacking of the GNU as possible, creating a nominal government of provincial unity, but really relegating their political allies to extremely unimportant portfolios at the provincial level. So you've got those two main factors. Then if we look at where the ANC might survive beyond 2026-7, it's not Gauteng, it's not KwaZulu-Natal, it's not the Western Cape. The Eastern Cape and the Free State are increasingly competitive. The Northern Cape is always weird. No one really knows what's going on there. But you end up with a party that really only has sort of the northern provinces left of Northwest, Mpumalanga and Limpopo. Now, the problem with those is the ANC being so addicted to patronage and power, those are not the provinces that generally offer the best routes to patronage. You do need the metros for that. You do need your Gautengs, your Western Capes, your KwaZulu-Natals for that. So the ANC's very model as to how it can recover seems to itself have no point of departure. There's no unity in terms of ideology. There's no unity in terms of leadership. There's no unity in between the regions. So this is a party showing almost no intention of learning the lessons. And you speak to some people in the know, and it's just clear that many of the ANC people are resigned and sort of depressed about this party, going nowhere quite fast.
What do you make of Action SA's performance, as I was alluding to earlier?
So I think that is impressive, but also, so they're on 23%, where they were on 22% in 2021, and 19%. They were on. Are you sure?
I think so. I'll double check, but go on.
Yeah. I've got them on. Oh, I see. Darby Scholz and Wayne Sisman have two varying numbers here. Okay, I'll go with Sisman. So they were on 19% and they went to 23%, which isn't bad growth, but that's almost exclusively the between 3 and 7% of vote that had been with the DA. So if I were Action SA, I'd definitely be chuffed with this result. It shows that the
discrepancy in those numbers is between the ward and the PR vote totals from 2021.
I see.
They did worse on the ward than they did on the PR vote.
Oh, I see. That makes sense. So if I were Action SA, I'd be relatively chuffed with this. This isn't by any means a sort of a breakout performance, but it is the sort of performance that Action SA need to see going into the next local government elections if they want to really register with any real impact. The problem for Action SA, of course, is that they are polling at, I think, 1 or below 1% nationally at the moment, and that's just not feasible. So I think if I were them, I'd be happy, but I don't think it's a portent of things to come. I don't think this is spelling a massive Action SA revival.
Are they benefiting from being perhaps the only sort of, I mean, of those parties that did well here, right? I mean, you look at who's on the ballot: MK, the EFF, ANC. If you wanted something, they're all selling a similar product, shall we say? The Action SA has a reputation as being slightly different from those, right? It's sort of much more considered the opposition camp. Are they benefiting from being the strongest sort of non-ANC blob force in this particular instance?
Because if you look at the parties, ANC, MK, ANC splinter, EFF, ANC splinter, PAC, ANC splinter, ATM, ANC splinter. And then you've got VUCA SA, which I know nothing about. So you've got 5 versions of the ANC and Action SA. So I think you're quite right that if you were a reasonably sensible voter looking for a more centrist, more moderate thing, the Action SA in that by-election was probably the closest you could come. I think I might even have voted Action SA were I forced to vote in that by-election. So I think Action SA have only contested, I think this is one of their first by-election contestations in quite a while. So we'll have to see how they do in the other ones. But with this one, I think they could be reasonably chuffed.
No, definitely. Okay, other important by-elections: Ward 1, which is basically on the western part of the Eastern Cape, in the Sarabotman municipality. Here, the ANC in 2021 won about 46% of the vote. The PA won 33% of the vote, and the DA about 21% of the vote. That was back in 2021. Things have changed. The DA vote has dropped quite a lot, going down from 21% in this ward to 9%. The PA from 33% up to 48%, and the ANC from 46 to 43%. So this is the first win for the PA in the Eastern Cape in terms of award, and it sort of continues that string of victories in the rural areas of the Western Cape and the Western Eastern Cape that the PA have been pulling off quite recently. Not a great result for the DA in this ward, I think. But what do you make of it? I mean, does this mean that like the DA is going to lose Cape Town or something like that? What can we draw anything bigger from this?
Yes, but I wouldn't say that this is necessarily relevant to Cape Town because this is a rural ward. I think where the DA is particularly weak and particularly vulnerable is with its traditional coloured vote in rural areas. There we see the Patriotic Alliance, with perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, really knocking some hard blows. So I don't think this means much for the DA in Cape Town or perhaps even in Nelson Mandela Bay. But in the rural wards, I think it really is quite a warning shot. And the PA continues to grow. I mean, what was astonishing is that they grew by almost 5,000% in the number of votes from 2019 to 2024, and they show little signs of stopping. What the DA really ought to hope for is that there seems to be a trend that where the PA had been in government at local level, they are not as popular. What the DA probably hopes for is that between now and the local government elections next year or early the year after, is that the PA and the ANC form a government and that the government isn't very popular, because there does genuinely seem to be a pattern that where the PA governs, it loses popularity in terms of its rural vote. Johannesburg is a bit of an exception because it's an exception in many ways. So, but if I were the DA, I'd be quite worried about your rural municipalities. If this can happen in the Eastern Cape, it can happen in the Western Cape as well. I don't think Cape Town as a metro is under threat, but certainly some of the more rural municipalities that they currently govern, most definitely.
Yeah, no, I think I tend to agree with that. I don't think I think there is this big distinction, and when you look at like something as crude as the colored vote, as sorry about that, it's not when you put it in those racial terms, you miss the distinctions. The rural voters of the Western Cape are different from even colored voters in the metros, are different from people who are middle class, are different from there's all these other things. And I think once you begin to peel back those layers and look more closely, you see that actually there's a slightly different dynamic going on here. Just looking around online, it looks like the best result the DA had in this particular ward was back in 2011 when they got about 37% of the vote. So always a place they've struggled, even if this is obviously a bit of a collapse in their vote total. This is seems like a place where they've always been a bit underperformed what perhaps they expected to, which is interesting.
And 2011 is an interesting year because people quite often look at 2016 as the breakthrough year in terms of local government. 2011 was actually the most important year because that was between 2011 and 2006. The difference between 2006 and 2011, the DA's performance increase is actually quite massive compared to the relative upward shift that they saw 5 years later in 2016. So 2011 really was in many instances the breakout local government election for the DA. So even if under those circumstances they couldn't break 40%, then this isn't a natural DA constituency. But what is quite interesting is that the turnout was relatively high. The turnout was 56%, where in the local government elections it had been 61%. Now that's actually decent turnout. You can properly that's a proper election. It's in that ward. Upcoming elections will likely have a similar turnout. So you can't scoff at this result, and the PA should feel quite chuffed that they are keeping the momentum that they garnered over the last year. And in my book about the election campaign last year, I make this point that you become relevant if you can make the big players respond to you and make the big players take you seriously. That's how you project relevance to your voters. So if the PA can do this to the DA and skrik op die lyf to the ANC to this extent, it's an indication that their relevance is showing no sign of abating.
Right, and this is a ward where the ANC now in this election got to 43% of the vote. Just looking at the results from this 2011, this was a ward where the ANC used to get like 63% of the vote.
Yeah.
So this is you can just see the decline. I mean, they're holding up better here than in some places, but it just shows how much the landscape is shifting. Okay, lastly, let's discuss the place of the EFF in all of this. The EFF has been quite interesting since the last elections. The EFF shrank slightly in the last national elections, 2024. They got just 9-ish% of the vote, slightly down from, I think they're 10-ish% of the vote that they got before. And the EFF has then had these defections. It had Floyd Shivambu leaving first to MK and now to start his own party. You had the sort of second, third in command or whatever, the EFF, Ndlozi going off to become some kind of Marxist academic-y type guy who, says gobbledygook on podcasts. And, it's not been entirely clear where the EFF goes to from here. I think the most recent SRF poll had the EFF on 3% of the vote, which is obviously not a great number. And kind of responding to this, Malema gave an interview at the beginning of this month saying that he's promising a, quote, dual strategy to revive the party's fortunes. He firstly said that he's going to mount legal challenges to the DA's suits on BEE and employment equity and kind of position the EFF as the biggest defender of BEE. And he also says that he's going to propose, quote, concrete industrial policy initiatives, particularly the beneficiation of mining and agriculture to drive industrialization and job creation. In other words, exactly what the ANC has been putting in all of their policy documents for, its entire existence. So he's basically just promising to be the ANC again, but in red rather than in yellow and green. Now, all of that said, this by-election in Bothaville in the north of the Free State, the ANC went down from 54% in 2021 to 50%. The EFF shot up from 25% to 47%. And then a local party called the NCF, the Nala Community Forum, saw their vote share collapse from 17% to 3%. So those votes presumably all went to the EFF. Hermann, does this mean that Malema and the EFF are bound for a comeback now? That they're going to take up all those ANC votes? Is this the beginning of the great EFF revival, or I don't know? Is it too early to say?
I don't think it's the beginning of the great EFF revival, but it is an indication that the EFF isn't gone, in the sense that the ANC, on its way out, those votes will need to go somewhere. Now, based on previous years of polling and some modeling I've done on the numbers, I think that the EFF could make a solid return to the double digits as the ANC loses its mojo. And I think in politics, it's important to understand that you position yourself for the voters you can get. You don't necessarily, it's no surprise to me that the EFF isn't taking on what they would consider neoliberal policies. So they are going to remain in the Afro-Marxist lane. And the fact that they are putting forward the policies that lost the ANC their majority to a significant extent shouldn't surprise us, because those voters are likely to need a home within the next 5 to 10 years, because the ANC isn't going to stick around forever. So Malema coming out swinging for a full-throated defense of BEE, look, it's not a popular policy, but it is a policy with its supporters. And South Africans, as a rule, aren't ideologues, never mind socialist ideologues. So it's not necessarily going to draw him this great big consensus vote. But that's never what the EFF has been about. The EFF has always been about making sure that they've got a base support enough to get to Parliament. And sort of, I think if they manage to remain competitive, i.e. around 6-7% for the next election cycle or two, they likely stand to gain from the defectors from the ANC, because they will be what the ANC used to be, in a sense. And then part of the ANC's mystique and part of the ANC's power is very much that its dominance was a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was so dominant because people thought it was so dominant, so people kept voting for it. With that spell broken, with this party now at 30%, the question of where those voters go won't necessarily be motivated by, these are the policies that cost the ANC their majority. It's just, yes, I do believe in the radicalism, the radical vibes of the EFF. So is this the great recovery of the EFF? I don't know. But I do think I was a fool about a year ago, I think, when I counted them out. And that was a mistake. I do think that if the ANC falls to 20% within the next few years, I think we see the EFF rise back up to 8%. If they fall further, the EFF reaches double digits again. But it won't be because the EFF is necessarily recovering and sort of launching a new insurgency. I think it'll be the ANC's voters that need a home, or some of the ANC's voters, the more radical ones, that need a political home.
So I wonder, I think the EFF's big strategic challenge at the moment is to differentiate itself from MK. Why would you vote for the EFF rather than MK? If you're that kind of voter who wants the sort of the racial messaging and the radical policies and all that, why not back MK, which is stronger and seems to be doing better at the moment than the EFF. And I do think in this particular area, they are benefiting heavily from the fact that this by-election, they were the strong horse. They could say, hey, you're angry with the ANC? Well, if you vote for the local party, the Nala Community Forum, which is the other contestant in this by-election, they did worse than us last time. That's not going to change anything. Vote for us. We're actually going to make the opportunity to challenge the ANC here. Very effective. I know the DA has often used that kind of messaging to win by-elections in many years. And I think in this particular instance, they may have just been benefiting from the anything but ANC vote, which I think is why it's why we can't necessarily draw too much from this one. I do wonder though about the EFF, because that sort of far left space is so sort of contested now, right? There's going to be Floyd Shivambu's Mabuya Africa, I think is the name of the party. There's all these other kind of parties that seem to be splintering off, these little ones from the ANC. There's like the ATM and stuff. I think your thesis does make a lot of sense in that some of these ANC voters need to go somewhere, and the MK is seen as too like KZN and Zulu focused and all that to win all of them. But there's so many of these other parties. I wonder if they're all just going to sort of dilute the vote between them in a way that the EFF will not be able to capture them. Now, what are your thoughts?
So, I want to address 2 points. Number one, why the EFF and not MK? Part of it is the fact that, well, not part of it. The significant part of it is the Zulu factor, in the sense that MK was able to rise so rapidly and so suddenly because of its very, very defined audience, its very defined voter target, and its very regionally focused campaign. The IFP, interestingly enough, between 1994 and 2016, when they sort of recovered, year by 2009, 11, people were writing the IFP off, calling time of death. What Buthelezi had been doing at the time was trying to campaign beyond KZN, and it just didn't work. So there seems to be quite something that if you want to be a Zulu party, be a Zulu party. And that's I think both a floor and a ceiling.
Right. Floyd Shivambu's presence in the structures of MK was the party very deliberately trying to not just be, a KZN Mpumalanga party.
And we all know how that went. Yes, exactly. So, but the other thing is as well that the EFF have proven its staying power more than I think MK has. MK is very heavily reliant on Zuma's personal political capital. And the EFF, I think, less so. By my calculations, Zuma is responsible for about 44% of the votes that MK got at the elections last year, while Malema is only responsible for 27% of the votes that the EFF got. Sorry, Zuma, MK, and Malema, EFF. I might have mixed those around. So voters do care about staying power. They don't really want to vote for pop-up parties. So I do think the EFF has a 10-year track record that could seem more official, more established, more appealing to voters, on top of the fact that the EFF can reach beyond the Zulu voter base, as powerful as that voter base might be. So yeah, the MK has a high floor and a low ceiling, where I think the EFF has a lower floor, but perhaps a bigger gap between it and its own ceiling. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think what you I get where you're coming from. Okay, so we've gone very long today because I don't know if it's clear to the audience, but I really enjoy these kind of discussions, and hopefully you found it interesting. I mean, I think we really are in this space where sort of there's a lot of pieces moving, and we don't quite know how they're going to all settle yet. So it's we'll obviously continue to watch this. At the end of the day, when you get to by-elections, you can draw some lessons from these things, but it's very dangerous to too big extrapolations. But I think what we're talking about here is not just based on these by-elections; it's based off of the much larger trends and other data we've seen. But I think there is, we're starting to see some indications of where things might be going, because by-elections are more useful for local government elections because they're actually a local government election in a specific area.
Yes.
So you can get a bit more of a barometer of how things are going.
And
With that,
you
though,
also
go ahead.
you also test the logistics of the party. That's a very important thing.
Especially in
by-elections. So for the EFF to have the logistics now, which I think it had lacked in the few months after the 2024 election, I do think the party had a problem of morale and motivating its activists and volunteers. The fact that it is showing some signs of life now, the party should see that as a positive for the upcoming general election campaign of local government.
Yeah, 100%. All right. With that, I think we're going to call it to a close. Thank you very much, Hermann, for your thoughts. And we will be back tomorrow with the live version of the Daily Friend show at 1:30. So do tune in on YouTube for that, or you can catch it afterwards on the podcast apps. It will be go up shortly after we finish recording it. We hope you found this interesting. And that's a wrap for today. The Daily Friend show and the Daily Friend are a project of the Institute of Race Relations, the IRR. The IRR is a think tank which was founded in 1929 to study race relations in South Africa and works to change government policy to improve race relations through non-racialism and to ensure the prosperity of all South Africans. If you like our work and would like to support us, please go to irr.org.za and click Support the IRR, or you can go to thedailyfriend.co.za and click the Fund Us button.